Welcome, everyone, to another on the record, off the record session with the pack. Our main theme today is trustworthy AI, and we have three people speaking today: Jeff, Josh, and myself. And we all met at a genAI conference. And so there's a little story we're going to tell about how we met and why that is really the reason that's driving this whole conversation. And so before we get into the actual conversation that Jeff is going to start us off with, Jeff and Josh, do you want to introduce yourselves?
I'm Jeff. I've been in the industry for a while. So I was at Google for 10 years, working at YouTube. Been at Snapchat for maybe like 7 years now. It's been a while. And a lot of the AI work that I do, though, is a side hustle, side project type of thing. So I've been doing a lot of work with Codex, Claude Code, coding workflows, and also this multi-model synthesis where you get different opinions and put them all together, used in coding design docs and just research analysis.
Hi, and I'm Josh. I'm a UCLA CS machine learning graduate and the founder of Step Habits. So Step is an AI coach that automatically tracks progress and motivates students to reach their personal goals. So that's most of my focus.
Awesome. And many of you probably know me, Beth Snodgrass, managing director, head of the pack. Have spent the past 15 years in consulting startups and in founding and building startup products. Jeff is going to start us off.
The story about this tool is, in some ways, it was Mary Beth's idea. We were at an AI conference, and then she asked the panel about detecting bias, like how can you detect bias or sycophancy in the response? And what she meant by that was the AI overly agreeing with you. So if you're like, hey, I think this is true, blah, 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 the AI often goes, you're absolutely right. We're all familiar with that phrase. And the panel didn't have a great answer there. It's not possible. Bias will always exist. You can't really do anything about it. So after she asked the question, I approached her and I showed her some prompts where you ask your original question to one AI or model, and then you can use other ones to critique the original response. And if you want to be as strong as possible, you can say, do adversarial analysis and look at this topic. So we got multiple models to evaluate her original position. And we went back and forth a bit, and eventually she solidified her arguments. So it's also like a partnership thing. It's not like you just get an answer, don't think about it. But this is something that I was doing all the time manually, just copying and pasting between different models. Then she's, oh, why don't you just build a tool for that? Actually, that'd be a good idea. It would save me time. That's the tool that I'm about to demo. And then here's like the adversarial analysis prompt. The actual prompt doesn't matter that much, but I would say basically you want to have AI generate a prompt like this for you. You review it yourself and you think this will give me the feedback that I want. Then you put it in other models, you see the feedback and you can adjust it. One thing I've noticed though is this version of the prompt, when you say adversarial analysis, sometimes it's a little too strong. I've started to just say balanced adversarial analysis or something like that, but you can play around with it.
Kamal just had a good question about why we need to use different models to do adversarial analysis prompts.
So I usually do same model and then multiple models. So you get a bit of everything. I can show, here was like an example question I have saved. All right. I'm an Asian man in tech. When could it be racism? And then ChatGPT gave me a very brief answer. And I know you can prompt it to get more stuff or you can turn on pro, but that's still the default. And then this is like a answer where it queried the 5 different LLMs and combined it. So it gave a more comprehensive answer. So I'll show a funny one. So I AI generate most of my design docs and then I like review them and correct them. So here's like a design doc. So you can actually like just copy and paste your whole design doc into here and then get feedback. So yeah, you can see like when you have multiple models, put it all together, it gives you a pretty nice like summary. I've included sources and stuff like that as well. So one thing I do is for all the models, I always turn on web search, letting them choose because I think you just get better results. And then what's cool here is you can see, okay, here's some different responses from each model. So you could compare what I get from each one. And then I also have this model contribution section, which kind of explains what they added to the overall answer.
I was just going to ask Kamal, is it clear why using different LLMs is important? Yes, it is. Okay, great. And I know this is a lot of content on the screen, so please add your questions to the chat.
Maybe the last thing I'd say is like each model has its strengths. The Gemini models are pretty good with design docs. They're probably trained on a lot of design docs at Google. Cerebrus is okay. It's just fast inference, so I use it to put all the answers together. It's decent for like web search, stuff like that. ChatGPT is just good overall. I wouldn't say it has one particular strength. And then Grok has the fresh data. And I'm not using the frontier models right now, just due to cost reasons.
Slightly, a little bit of a detour now. How I was brought in, so a little bit of a background story. The first time that I had gone to an event with lots of kind of different VCs and founders, I had a pretty particular interaction with an investor where I watched them, I guess, just for lack of a better phrase, interact with the female founder in a really uncomfortable manner. And I kind of left reflecting on just how difficult it must be being a woman entrepreneur. I think early stage founders are constantly having high stakes interactions with investors that they very much need things from. And then meanwhile, VCs are often wealthier and presumptuous, or at least risk tolerant, right? So I'd guess that all of that kind of breeds a particular type of power dynamic. And so I met Mary Beth and Jeff a few months after this, and we wound up talking about kind of gender dynamics and things like this. And that memory came up, and I had shared the encounter with Mary Beth. And I still remember that she had politely asked me, "Are you wondering if that dynamic makes it easier for women in the startup scene?" And it just floored me a little bit. I think I had said, no, I'm not asking if objectification is a net positive, because that's a pretty insane position. But clearly, she felt like she needed to test what my personal beliefs were in order to know how to best navigate the conversation. And I found that quite telling. I think that kind of code switching speaks to the amount of education she's attempted to do and has a million other implications about the beliefs of the people that she's interacting with. It had a similar vibe of telling the aggressive guy on the bus that you're honored to have his attention, but you unfortunately have a boyfriend. Learned diplomacy in the face of an absurd reality. And so Mary Beth asked me to join and share that story, and I thought it would be a nice opportunity to hear some different perspectives. So that's my attempt at preaching to the choir, but that was how most of this came about for me.
Thanks so much for sharing that. It stood out to me that of the, I think, long conversation we had about a lot of different topics, that was the one part of the conversation that stood out to you too. And so it turns out that the conversation I'd had with Jeff just prior to meeting Josh was the one that led Jeff to create this new tool. There's a bit of a backstory to the question I asked the panel that Jeff ended up answering. The story is, I had been invited to join a VC's podcast to talk about one of my entrepreneurial journeys. And before the interview, I looked at past guest speakers and I saw that there were no women, or at least I didn't see any women. And I asked if I would be the first women entrepreneur to be interviewed. And I was told no, there had been one other woman. And that actually made me excited because it meant that I could be one of the first and open windows potentially for other women entrepreneurs. And I'd be representing women in a sense, which is on brand with our pack. So prepared for the interview, had the interview. Weeks later, I received an edited copy of that conversation with a title that would be on different websites. And the title focused on failure. And failure was one of the things we covered, but we covered a lot more than that in the conversation. And failure to me didn't describe my entrepreneurial journey. And it wasn't a really important takeaway of the conversation that we had. So I asked why that was the focus. And I was told that the title had been optimized for reach, and using the word failed in titles helps get more traffic essentially online. So it's basically marketing tactic. But I shared that the title didn't reflect the conversation, the journey, and proposed different ones, but acknowledged the decision is up to the host, and the host went with the title focused on failure. And so even after it was published, I was really uncomfortable with it. And I wasn't quite sure why. And so what I like to do is use data and research to get clarity. So I dug into the research and the data, and I was reminded that women are penalized for taking risks. Women entrepreneurs are penalized more than men for failure. There's a lot of research. Actually, Josh asked for some of the research and he got more than he asked for. So if anyone here is interested in the research, that's available. And then I dug into the math, meaning I looked at all the past guest speakers on this podcast, tallied up the number of men and women, and how failed was used in headlines. And it turns out of 156 guest speakers, 97% are men and 2.4% are women. So since I was invited to join, more women had been invited. So there was a grand total of 4 women out of 156. And even though it's only 2.4% of speakers that are women, that's actually very representative, because using a 30-year average, 2.6% of VC-backed startups are led by women. That's a representative statistic. The problem that I saw was that 3.8% of the titles had failed as part of the episode title. And then when you break it down by gender, 97% are male speakers, but only had failed in their titles 2.6% of the time, while of the 2.4% women speakers, 50% are labeled as failed. Now, when we consider that 90 to 95% of startups actually fail, there's a lot of different ways to characterize that. And I think we could have a whole different discussion on what that actually means. It is surprising that the podcast would only attribute failure to 2 to 3% of men interviewed, when using that word fail or failure is such an effective marketing tactic for them. So I gave the math to AI. I didn't share any context. I just said, these are the stats on a podcast. And I'm curious, what do you think this means? Because I didn't want to be biased in how I was looking at the situation. And so there's a long response, and it basically said, this podcast is featuring male entrepreneurs as archetypes of success and women as case studies of failure. This was validating for me, because I suspected there was this issue, but I also didn't want to accept this as the answer, because I do know that AI can be sycophantic, and I've used this tool before, and it's possible, I couldn't remember, but it's possible I may have asked other questions about bias or had other questions that led the AI to, recognize that I'm a woman in tech and give me an answer that would align with my experience. So not that long after, I meet Jeff, and he does this whole stress testing process. And when I looked at the responses across the different AI platforms, it became clear that there was a pattern. So to quote from one of the answers, the unicorn hunter theory could explain why the VC took this approach. The true unstated goal of the podcast may be to find a very specific tech profit archetype, one that's charismatic, hyper-aggressive, and relentlessly self-promoting. And for all the women on this session, I'm sure you know that relentless self-promotion is not something that's rewarded. What that said to me is that it's possible that the podcast itself or the VC firm itself may be pursuing a strategy to attract and invest in a unicorn archetype, or who they believe is a unicorn archetype. And so this would be a shadow strategy. Like, they're not out there promoting that they're looking for hyper aggressive, relentlessly self-promoting unicorns, but that could be driving some of the decision making unconsciously. I shared the data on gender and headlines with the VC, and I said I had some insights about strategy that might be of interest. And we ended up having a really good conversation about a lot of different things in VC, including growth at all costs, hunting. And by the end of the conversation, I said that I really didn't want to be part of perpetuating a bias that women are the archetypes of failure and men are the archetypes of success. And so we offered to change the title. And so this long story is meant to share that if we have the data and we use this robust stress testing process, which now Jeff has put into one tool, and then we're working on basically productizing the prompts, we can see patterns that indicate what a shadow strategy is that somebody's pursuing, and then have a conversation about that, because it's much easier to have a conversation about strategy than it is about blind spots. Does anyone have thoughts, comments on blind spots, bias, using AI to actually detect it rather than perpetuate it or be sycophantic? Any experience with sycophantic AI that brings anyone here today?
Mary Beth, what's powerful about the story you told is what it feels as a female entrepreneur to run up against what she's calling these shadow biases, which are there. What we as women entrepreneurs encounter a lot is that sort of invisible wall that we're playing the game as it's designed. We're supposed to meet with VCs. We're supposed to do the pitching. We do all of the things, but our results are drastically different. 2.4% of us get the dollars. And so being able to politely point out, which I think tools like this can allow us to do, is it allows us to then have the fuel to not just say what we know, but also offer the alternatives. Because I think most people are rational and reasonable and are willing to change their mind if they have the path shown to them, as opposed to them then having to do the work to fix it. And so I think this is a powerful way for us to use AI to help us break down some of the barriers that we see all the time as women entrepreneurs.
I would love to hear more myself about exactly how to make AI less sycophantic, because it really bothers me. And whenever I attempt to get the AI to critique itself, it seems to shut down somehow. And maybe I haven't tried enough. It's just an area I'm still newish to it, but it's really bothering to me.
Even the simplest thing of trying to open a different chat window and having it critique the original one. Have you ever given that a step?
No, I've always done it within the same window. Even think it would matter.
So basically, you can think of that second window as like almost a different person. And a person in some ways is an accumulation of life history or whatever, right? And then this chat or what you're getting is an accumulation of the conversation history. And to be fair, there's some shared memory across all convos, right? But there's that. So when you open a new chat, it's actually pretty independent of the original one. It wouldn't have the same bias. And you could even ask the original chat to go craft me an adversarial analysis prompt or something simpler. Give me a second opinion prompt. You put it into the second chat, and then that'll actually give you a kind of like reasonable critique. You could put it back into the first chat, go back and forth a bit. So I automatically do it with my tool, but even everyone can do it manually. And I was doing it manually before. The other thing, I'll give a short story, which is funny but scary. There was someone who was undergoing a sort of delusion through AI where he believed he had superpowers and had discovered some secret law of the universe. And people were going like, hey, like maybe that's not right. But he was actually reflective though. So he was like, wait a minute, could I really have superpower? But he would ask the same window and the window's like, yes, you really do have those powers. He's like, you sure? What about this? So he had ChatGPT, which induced this hallucination or whatever, reality break. And then one day he was at work and he's like, oh, wait a minute, I've got another AI at work, Gemini. It had no context. He said, Gemini, could any of this be true? Gemini's like, absolutely not. That's all fake. And then he took the Gemini response and put it back into his original ChatGPT convo. And the ChatGPT convo was like, I'm sorry, I was wrong. It's a very extreme example, but it illustrates like that value of that fresh perspective and What I do in the tool is make it more convenient. You get 5 more and put it all together in an answer. But you can always manually copy and paste it too.
Takeaways I want to leave you all with are about how we can use AI to navigate challenging scenarios, which in this case it's blind spots, more strategic and more effectively. We can also use AI to help us influence decisions that we're told or we believe are not influenceable. And for me, a really telling result or lesson from my experience is that when women entrepreneurs have opportunities, and they may be rare opportunities, to tell their stories or give their pitches on their startups or open windows for other women entrepreneurs, the headlines can be retrofitted to other narratives, and it's often unintentional and unconscious. And this can perpetuate bias. This happens in the media a lot. So I think it's just important to recognize